Story 1. Are you a lunder? Rain came down hard that night, tapping against the windows like impatient fingers drumming on a table. I watched the droplets race each other down the glass, my breath fogging up the cold surface. My parents had left in a hurry, something about an emergency at work. They promised they'd be back soon. But as the hours dragged on, I felt the weight of the empty house pressing down on me. It wasn't the first time I'd been left alone, but tonight felt different. The storm outside was relentless, the wind howling like a wild animal, shaking the trees and rattling the windows. The darkness seemed thicker and more oppressive, and every creak of the house made me uneasy. I tried to distract myself with the TV, but the static on the screen only added to the eerie atmosphere. The lights flickered occasionally, as if the power was debating whether to stay on or give up entirely. A knock at the door jolted me from my thoughts. It was unexpected, and my heart skipped a beat. Who would be out in this weather? I hesitated, the remote still in my hand, before slowly getting up and heading to the door. The knock came again, more insistent this time. I saw a woman standing on the porch, drenched, her clothes clinging to her like a second skin. I didn't recognize her at first, but then I remembered the new neighbor who had moved in a few houses down. She had introduced herself a few days ago, but we hadn't talked much. Now here she was in the middle of a storm, standing on my doorstep. I opened the door just a crack, enough to see her face. Her eyes were wide, almost wild, and her hair was plastered to her forehead. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Are you alone?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the rain. The question caught me off guard. I didn't know how to answer. Why would she ask that? Something about her tone, the way she looked at me, was terrifying. I nodded slowly, unsure of what else to do. She tilted her head slightly as if studying me, and then, without another word, she turned and walked away. I stood there frozen, watching her disappear into the darkness. The rain swallowed her up, and she was gone. I shut the door quickly, locking it behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest, the echo of her question still ringing in my ears. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a harmless inquiry, nothing more. Maybe she was concerned, maybe she was just making sure I was okay, but the way she vanished into the night without saying goodbye, without even looking back, it didn't feel right. I returned to the living room, but I couldn't focus on the TV anymore. The house felt different, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting her to come back, to knock again, but the only sound was the relentless pounding of the rain. An hour passed, maybe more, and I started to relax, convincing myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I heard its footsteps. They were faint at first, just a soft creaking above me. I froze, straining to listen. The footsteps grew louder and heavier, like someone was walking slowly across the floor upstairs. I felt the blood drain from my face. I knew I was alone in the house. My parents wouldn't be back until much later, and no one else had a key. The footsteps continued, moving from one room to the next methodically, like whoever was up there was searching for something or someone. Panic surged through me, and I bolted from the living room, heading for the front door. But before I reached it, the footsteps stopped. I paused, my hand on the doorknob, my heart racing. The silence was deafening, the kind that presses down on you, making you feel like you can't breathe. I forced myself to look back, my eyes traveling to the top of the stairs, half expecting to see a shadowy figure standing there, but there was nothing, just the dark hallway, the shadows stretching long and thin in the dim light. Taking a deep breath, I slowly crept up the stairs, each step feeling like a mile. The air was thick and heavy with tension. When I reached the top, I hesitated, listening. Everything was silent. I turned towards my parents' bedroom, the door slightly ajar, and pushed it open. Two men stood in the room, their backs to me. They were dressed in dark clothes, their faces obscured by the shadows. I didn't recognize them, and the sight of Them sent a jolt of fear through me. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening, but I didn't have time to think. They hadn't noticed me yet, and I knew I had to act fast. I spun on my heel and ran, taking the stairs two at a time. Heard them behind me, their footsteps thundering down the hall as they gave chase. I didn't look back. My only thought was to get out, to escape. I reached the front door, fumbling with the lock, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. The door flew open, and I stumbled outside, the rain hitting me like a wall of ice. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street. My breath coming in ragged gasps, I pulled out my phone with trembling hands and called the police. My voice barely coherent as I tried to explain what had happened. By the time the police arrived, the men were gone. The house was empty, just as I had left it. But the officers found signs of a break-in upstairs, drawers opened, belongings tossed around, but there was no sign of the men, no clue as to who they were or what they wanted. As I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that they would come back. Or worse, that they had never really left. Story 2. The grave. I've always believed that cemeteries are places of peace, there where we say our final goodbyes, where the dead find rest, and where the living can reflect on the lives that have passed. For years, I visited the grave of my late wife Elisa every Sunday. It was a ritual, a way to feel close to her even though she was no longer in this world. But on one visit, something happened that still haunts me to this day. It was late afternoon. When I arrived at the cemetery, the sky was a dull gray, and the sun was hidden behind thick clouds. The wind was unusually cold for that time of year, cutting through my jacket and chilling me to the bone. I parked my car at the entrance and walked the familiar path to Eliza's grave, the crunch of gravel under my feet the only sound in the stillness. As I approached her grave, I noticed something odd. A man was standing a few rows away, close enough to see but too far to make out his features. He wasn't someone I'd seen before, and his presence made me uneasy. It wasn't unusual to see other people visiting graves, but there was something off about this man. He was just standing there, not looking at any specific grave but staring in my direction. I brushed it off and focused on Eliza's grave, kneeling to clear away some fallen leaves. I spoke to her as I always did, telling her about my week, how the kids were doing, and how much I missed her. The man was still there, though lingering in my peripheral vision. I tried to ignore him, but it wasn't easy. His presence felt wrong, intrusive, like he didn't belong there. After a while, I stood up and took a step back from the grave, ready to leave. That's when I noticed the man was closer, no much closer. He had moved without me even hearing a sound. My heart started to race as he approached me with slow, deliberate steps. His clothes were worn and dirty, and his eyes were wild, glinting with something I couldn't quite place. Desperation, maybe, or anger. "Got any money?" he asked, his voice rough and gravelly. It wasn't a simple question, it was more of a demand. The way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. There was no politeness in his tone, just a cold, hard edge. "I don't have any cash on me," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. It was true. I never carried much cash, especially not when visiting the cemetery. I never had a reason to. He didn't seem to believe me. He took another step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Don't lie to me," he hissed. "Everyone's got something. Give it to me." I shook my head, more out of instinct than anything else. "I don't have anything for you," I said, a bit more firmly this time. My pulse quickened as he moved even closer, blocking my path back to the car. I could see the tension in his body, the way his fists clenched and unclenched. This wasn't just a man looking for money. This was something more dangerous. The air around us seemed to thicken, and the cemetery, which had always been a place of comfort for me, now felt hostile and threatening. I glanced around, hoping to see someone else, anyone who could help, but the cemetery was empty. It was just me and this man who was now standing only a few feet away, his breath ragged and uneven. "Give me what you've got," he demanded again, his voice rising in anger. The way he looked at MIT was like he was ready to lash out at any moment. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but I knew I couldn't overpower him. He was younger, stronger, and desperate. "I'm leaving now," I said, trying to sound calm though my voice shook. I took a step to the side, attempting to go around him, but he moved with me, blocking my path. The cemetery seemed to close in around us, the tombstones like silent witnesses to what was happening. The man was still there, though lingering in my peripheral vision. I tried to ignore him, but it wasn't easy. His presence felt wrong, intrusive, like he didn't belong there. After a while, I stood up and took a step back from the grave, ready to leave. That's when I noticed the man was closer, no much closer. He had moved without me even hearing a sound. My heart started to race as he approached me with slow, deliberate steps. His clothes were worn and dirty, and his eyes were wild, glinting with something I couldn't quite place. Desperation, maybe, or anger. "Got any money?" he asked, his voice rough and gravelly. It wasn't a simple question, it was more of a demand. The way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. There was no politeness in his tone, just a cold, hard edge. "I don't have any cash on me," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. It was true. I never carried much cash, especially not when visiting the cemetery. I never had a reason to. He didn't seem to believe me. He took another step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Don't lie to me," he hissed. "Everyone's got something. Give it to me." I shook my head, more out of instinct than anything else. "I don't have anything for you," I said, a bit more firmly this time. My pulse quickened as he moved even closer, blocking my path back to the car. I could see the tension in his body, the way his fists clenched and unclenched. This wasn't just a man looking for money. This was something more dangerous. The air around us seemed to thicken, and the cemetery, which had always been a place of comfort for me, now felt hostile and threatening. I glanced around, hoping to see someone else, anyone who could help, but the cemetery was empty. It was just me and this man who was now standing only a few feet away, his breath ragged and uneven. "Give me what you've got," he demanded again, his voice rising in anger. The way he looked at MIT was like he was ready to lash out at any moment. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but I knew I couldn't overpower him. He was younger, stronger, and desperate. "I'm leaving now," I said, trying to sound calm though my voice shook. I took a step to the side, attempting to go around him, but he moved with me, blocking my path. The cemetery seemed to close in around us, the tombstones like silent witnesses to what was happening. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the panic rising inside me. "I'm warning you," he growled, his voice low and menacing. He took another step closer, and I could see the madness in his eyes now, a dangerous glint that made my blood run cold. He wasn't going to let me leave, not without giving him something, but I had nothing to give him, and that realization filled me with a kind of terror I hadn't felt in years, not since the day I lost Elisa. Without thinking, I turned and ran. My legs moved before my mind could catch up, the instinct to survive overwhelming everything else. I heard him shout something behind me, but I didn't stop to listen. I sprinted down the gravel path, the sound of my footsteps echoing in my ears. The wind whipped against my face, and the gray sky above seemed to darken as I ran, as if the whole world was closing in on me. I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I threw myself inside, locking the doors and starting the engine in one frantic motion. When I looked up, the man was nowhere to be seen. He had vanished as quickly as he had appeared, leaving only the memory of his wild eyes and threatening voice. I drove straight to the police station, my heart still racing, my mind reeling from what had just happened. I told them everything about the man in the cemetery, how he demanded money, how he blocked my path, and how I had barely escaped. They took my statement and said they'd investigate, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. People visit cemeteries, all the time. Maybe they thought it was just some homeless man looking for a handout. A few days later, I got a call from the police. They found him, the man who had confronted me, but he wasn't alive. They found his body in the cemetery beneath a broken grave. His neck was twisted at an unnatural angle, his eyes wide open, staring at nothing. There was no sign of how he had died or how he ended up under that grave. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. The police asked me if I knew anything more, if I had seen anyone else in the cemetery that day, but I hadn't. It was just him and me, just us and the graves. I still visit Eliza's grave, but now I only go during the day, when the sun is high and the world feels safe. But every time I walk down that path, I can't help but feel that someone is watching me, lurking in the shadows between the tombstones. And sometimes, late at night, I dream of wild eyes and hear a rough voice demanding something I can't give. Story 3. The forest. We decided to go camping deep in the woods, away from the crowded trails and noise of the city. The weekend promised clear skies, and the idea of being surrounded by nature, with nothing but the rustle of leaves and the songs of birds, seemed like the perfect escape. My friend Jake and I had been planning this trip for months, carefully selecting a spot far from civilization where the forest was dark, the trees looming like silent sentinels. I scanned the clearing, looking for the source of the sound, but saw nothing unusual. The fire's embers glowed faintly, casting a dim light, but there was no movement, no sign of anything out of place. Relieved, I started to pull the flap shut when something caught my eye. Just beyond the edge of the clearing, where the shadows of the trees were thickest, there were footprints. They were clear, unmistakable imprints in the soft earth, leading toward our tent. My breath caught in my throat. They were too large to be from an animal and too fresh to have been there before we set up camp. I stared at them, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Who could have made those prints? We hadn't seen anyone else all day, and we were miles from the nearest town. The thought of someone or something lurking in the darkness, watching us, sent a chill down my spine. I shook Jake awake, my voice barely above a whisper. He grumbled, rubbing his eyes, but when he saw the look on my face, he sat up instantly, alert. I pointed to the footprints, and his expression shifted from confusion to alarm. We sat in silence, listening for any sound, any sign that we weren't alone. That's when we heard Ither chanting. It was distant at first, so faint that we might have missed it if we weren't straining to hear. A low rhythmic murmur, like a voice carried on the wind. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unsettling, a monotonous drone that seemed to seep into the very air around us. The chanting grew louder, more distinct, though the words were still incomprehensible. It was coming from the direction of the footprints, from the dense woods just beyond our camp. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. We exchanged a glance, both of us too scared to speak. The chanting was getting closer, more intense, and with it came a sense of dread that hung heavy in the air. Then, through the darkness, we saw him. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the dim light of our dying fire. He was tall and gaunt, his clothes ragged and filthy, hanging off him like tattered rags. His hair was long and matted, obscuring most of his face, but what I could see in his eyes was enough to freeze the blood in my veins. They were hollow and empty, as if there was nothing human behind them. He stood there, swaying slightly, his lips moving in that same eerie chant. His voice was barely above a whisper, but the words, whatever they were, seemed to vibrate in the air, filling the clearing with an unnatural energy. Jake and I were frozen in place, unable to move, unable to tear our eyes away from the figure. For what felt like an eternity, he just stood there, muttering to himself, his eyes unfocused. Then, without warning, he lunged at us, his arms outstretched, his chant turning into a guttural scream. We scrambled backward, tripping over each other in our panic. Jake grabbed a branch from the fire, brandishing it like a weapon. The embers flaring to life as he swung it at the man. The figure recoiled, a low growl escaping his throat. For a moment he seemed to hesitate, his hollow eyes flickering with some unreadable emotion. Then, with a final haunting whisper, he turned and fled back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness as suddenly as he had appeared. We didn't wait to see if he would return. We grabbed what we could carry and bolted, leaving our tent and most of our gear behind. We ran through the forest, branches whipping at our faces, the chanting still echoing faintly in our ears. When we finally reached the trailhead, exhausted and terrified, we collapsed on the ground, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. It wasn't until the sun began to rise that we felt safe enough to move again. We reported the incident to the authorities, but they didn't seem surprised. They told us about the man, how he had been living in the woods for years, performing strange rituals, targeting campers who wandered too far into his territory. We never went back to that forest. Even now, years later, the memory of that night sends a chill down my spine. The man, his hollow eyes, and the haunting chants still linger in my mind, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected places. Story 4. The highway. Been a truck driver for over 10 years, spending most of my life on the road. The highway has always been my second home. Long, endless roads, the hum of the engine, and the steady rhythm of the wheels beneath me were my companions. But this night was different, one that would stay with me forever. It was late, maybe around 2 a.m., and I was driving through a remote stretch of road. The sky was pitch black, with only the occasional flash of headlights from oncoming cars. The road was empty, as it usually was at this hour. My eyes were heavy, and the monotonous landscape wasn't helping. I had been driving for hours and was looking forward to the next rest stop, which was still about 50 miles away. As I rounded a bend, my headlights caught something in the distance. At first, I thought it was an animal, but as I got closer, I realized it was a man. He was standing by the side of the road, alone in the dark. He wore a long dark coat that seemed too heavy for the warm summer night. His head was down, and his hair hung limply over his face. There was something off about him. I could feel it, but I pushed it aside, telling myself it was just my imagination. As a truck driver, I'd seen plenty of strange things on the road. Maybe he was just a hitchhiker. I slowed down as I approached him, not because I wanted to pick him up, but out of curiosity. There was no way anyone should be out here at this hour, miles away from the nearest town. My truck rolled to a stop, a few feet away from him. For a moment, I considered driving away, but something made me hesitate. He didn't move. He just stood there, as if he hadn't noticed me at all. I honked the horn a short, loud blast. His head jerked up, and for the first time, I saw his face. My breath caught in my throat. His skin was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were wide, empty, and lifeless. There was a strange look in them, something that made me want to drive away as fast as I could. But then he moved. Slowly, he raised his hand and pointed down the road, as if asking for a ride. I hesitated, my foot hovering over the gas pedal. Every instinct told me to leave, but something in his eyes held me in place. It was as if he was pleading with me, begging for help. I opened the passenger door, unsure why I was doing it. He climbed in without a word, his movements slow and deliberate. The door closed with a soft click, and the truck suddenly felt much smaller, the air thick with tension. I tried to start a conversation, but he remained silent, staring straight ahead. His presence was unnerving. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I felt a cold sweat forming on my forehead. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As we drove, I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, and I noticed they were covered in dirt, or was it something else? I couldn't tell in the dim light, but it looked dark, almost like dried blood. My heart started pounding in my chest, each beat louder than the last. The road stretched on, and the silence between us grew heavier. I felt trapped in my truck, my mind racing with thoughts of who this man could be. Was he in trouble, or was I the one in danger? The night seemed to grow darker, the shadows deeper, The headlights only illuminated a small patch of road ahead, leaving the rest of the world in pitch-black darkness. The man hadn't moved or spoken since he got in. His eyes were fixed on the road, but I couldn't tell if he was seeing anything. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to break the silence. "Where are you headed?" I asked, my voice shaky. He didn't respond. I tried again, louder this time, but still nothing. It was as if he didn't hear me, or maybe he didn't want to answer. Then, out of nowhere, he turned his head slowly to look at me. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. They were dark, bottomless pits that seemed to suck the light out of the cab. I had never seen eyes like that before, and I hope I never do again. Suddenly he grinned a twisted, unnatural smile that sent a wave of fear crashing over me. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles white. I didn't know what he was, but I knew I had to get away. I pressed down on the gas, my truck speeding up. The engine roared, and the truck lurched forward. But the man's smile didn't fade. He leaned closer, his breath hot on my skin. I could feel his eyes boring into me, even though I couldn't bring myself to look at him. The rest stop was only a few miles away. I focused on that under lights. I could just barely see in the distance. If I could just make it there, I'd be safe. But the road seemed to stretch on forever, the lights never getting any closer. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the rest stop appeared on the horizon. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a new wave of fear. The man hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but I could feel his presence growing stronger, more oppressive. As I pulled into the rest stop, I slammed on the brakes and threw the truck into park. The man turned to me, his smile gone, replaced by that same empty stare. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was frozen with fear. Then, without a word, he opened the door and stepped out into the night. He didn't look back. As he walked away, disappearing into the shadows, I sat there, staring at the open door, my heart racing. It took me a long time to calm down, to convince myself that it was over. But even now, when I'm driving alone at night, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, waiting for his next ride. Story 5. The house. It was a Friday night, and I was looking forward to a quiet evening at home. I had just finished dinner and was settling onto the couch with a book. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards, which I had long since gotten used to. It was an old house, after all, and old houses have their noises. As I turned the page, my eyes caught sight of something strange. The vase on the coffee table was slightly out of place. I could have sworn I'd scented it perfectly earlier. I shook my head and laughed at myself. Maybe I was getting a little too particular. I reached out, adjusting it back to its proper spot, and returned to my book, but the unease didn't leave me. Every so often I'd glance up, feeling like something was off. Maybe it was just my imagination. After all, I'd been stressed at work lately, and it wasn't unusual for that to carry over into my personal life. Still, the house felt different tonight, like someone was watching me. An hour passed, and I decided to head to the kitchen for a snack. As I walked in, I stopped dead in my tracks. The drawer where I kept my utensils was open just a crack, but open nonetheless. I was sure I hadn't left it that way. My hand trembled slightly as I closed it, trying to push down the rising sense of unease. I convinced myself it was the draft from the old windows, or maybe I hadn't closed it properly earlier. I shook it off and made my way back to the living room, but now I couldn't relax. My eyes kept darting around the room, searching for anything else that might be out of place. And another hour passed. I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth before bed when I noticed that the hand towel was on the floor. It had been neatly folded on the rack the last time I was here. I stared at it, my heart beginning to pound. Was I losing my mind? The night wore on, and the small disturbances continued. My keys were no longer on the kitchen counter where I had left them. They were in the hallway on the side table. A picture frame on the bookshelf was now tilted at an odd angle. My shoes had been moved slightly, just enough for me to notice. I felt my pulse quicken, my breath coming in short, Shallow gasps. Something was wrong, very wrong. I decided to take action. I wasn't imagining these things. They were real, and I needed to find out what was going on. I had a small hidden camera that I used to keep an eye on my dog when I was at work. I set it up in the living room, aimed at the main area where most of the disturbances had occurred. The night was growing late, and exhaustion was beginning to weigh on me, but the thought of sleeping was terrifying. What if something happened while I was asleep? But I couldn't stay up forever, so I forced myself to go to bed, leaving the camera to record. The house was eerily quiet as I lay in bed, every creak and groan of the old wood setting my nerves on edge. I kept telling myself that I was overreacting, that nothing was wrong. My heart pounded in my chest as I finally drifted off to sleep, though it was a fitful, uneasy sleep. When I woke up the next morning, I felt drained, like I hadn't rested at all. My first thought was to check the camera. I hurried to the living room, my fingers shaking as I picked up my phone to review the footage. What I saw made my blood run cold. The first few hours were uneventful, just me moving around the house and adjusting things. But then, shortly after I went to bed, the camera caught movement. A man thin emerged from the hallway, his eyes darting around as if he were making sure the coast was clear. He moved quickly but not hurriedly, as if he knew exactly where he was going. My breath caught in my throat as I watched him walk to the living room, stopping just behind the couch. He stood there, staring at where I had been sitting, his head slightly tilted, as if he were trying to listen for something. Then, slowly, he turned and looked directly at the camera, his eyes wide and unblinking. I dropped the phone. He had been in the house the whole time watching me, moving my things. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me several tries to pick up the phone again. I had to see the rest of the footage. The man didn't stay long in the living room. After a few minutes, he moved towards the hallway again, disappearing from view. But the camera had picked up something else. Just before he vanished, he glanced upwards towards the ceiling. My blood turned to ice as I realized what that meant. He had been living in the attic. I could barely breathe as I dialed 911, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation to the operator. The wait for the police felt like an eternity, but when they arrived, they acted quickly. 2 officers went up to the attic while I stood in the doorway, too terrified to move. They found him up there, huddled in a corner. He was homeless, they said, and had lied. Then, out of nowhere, he turned his head slowly to look at me. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. They were dark, bottomless pits that seemed to suck the light out of the cab. I had never seen eyes like that before, and I hope I never do again. Suddenly he grinned a twisted, unnatural smile that sent a wave of fear crashing over me. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles white. I didn't know what he was, but I knew I had to get away. I pressed down on the gas, my truck speeding up. The engine roared, and the truck lurched forward. But the man's smile didn't fade. He leaned closer, his breath hot on my skin. I could feel his eyes boring into me, even though I couldn't bring myself to look at him. The rest stop was only a few miles away. I focused on that under lights. I could just barely see in the distance. If I could just make it there, I'd be safe. But the road seemed to stretch on forever, the lights never getting any closer. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the rest stop appeared on the horizon. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a new wave of fear. The man hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but I could feel his presence growing stronger, more oppressive. As I pulled into the rest stop, I slammed on the brakes and threw the truck into park. The man turned to me, his smile gone, replaced by that same empty stare. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was frozen with fear. Then, without a word, he opened the door and stepped out into the night. He didn't look back. As he walked away, disappearing into the shadows, I sat there, staring at the open door, my heart racing. It took me a long time to calm down, to convince myself that it was over. But even now, when I'm driving alone at night, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, waiting for his next ride. Story 5. The house. It was a Friday night, and I was looking forward to a quiet evening at home. I had just finished dinner and was settling onto the couch with a book. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards, which I had long since gotten used to. It was an old house, after all, and old houses have their noises. As I turned the page, my eyes caught sight of something strange. The vase on the coffee table was slightly out of place. I could have sworn I'd centered it perfectly earlier. I shook my head and laughed at myself. Maybe I was getting a little too particular. I reached out, adjusting it back to its proper spot, and returned to my book, but the unease didn't leave me. Every so often I'd glance up, feeling like something was off. Maybe it was just my imagination. After all, I'd been stressed at work lately, and it wasn't unusual for that to carry over into my personal life. Still, the house felt different tonight, like someone was watching me. An hour passed, and I decided to head to the kitchen for a The air felt heavier now, like something was watching me, waiting. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. I decided to finish up my work quickly and leave. Faster I could get out of there, the better. I focused on the screen, my fingers moving quickly over the keyboard, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. But then, the lights flickered. It was subtle at first, just a small flicker in the corner of the room. But then it happened again, stronger this time. The overhead lights blinked once, twice, and then went out, leaving me in near darkness. The only light left was the soft glow of my laptop screen. That's when I saw it. The figure wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was clear now, a dark, ghostly figure standing directly behind me. I froze, my hands hovering over the keyboard, too afraid to move. The figure didn't move either, but I could feel its presence, and oppressive, like it was waiting for something. That my breathing became shallow, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. Slowly, I reached out and touched the edge of the laptop, hoping that if I closed it, the figure would disappear. But as soon as my fingers brushed the screen, the figure moved. It stepped closer, its outline becoming clearer. I could almost see its face, now pale and blurred, like something out of a nightmare. My heart raced, and without thinking, I jumped up from my chair, knocking it over in the process. I didn't stop to look back. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door, my footsteps echoing through the empty office. As I reached the hallway, I glanced back one last time and I saw it standing at my desk, looking directly at me through the dark. I didn't slow down until I was outside, the cold night air hitting my face as I stumbled onto the sidewalk. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. It felt unreal, like a bad dream, but the fear was too real to ignore. I stood outside the building for a few minutes, catching my breath and trying to make sense of what had just happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't explain it. There was no logical reason for what I had seen, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back in there. The next morning, I sent an email to my boss resigning from the job. I didn't give a reason. I didn't need to. I just knew I couldn't spend another night in that office, not after what I had seen. To this day, I still don't know what that figure was. Maybe it was a ghost. Or maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me after too many late nights. But whatever it was, it made sure I never set foot in that office again. Story 7. The old building. I didn't know why I agreed to go into the old building. Maybe it was the thrill of doing something forbidden, or maybe it was just to prove to myself that I wasn't afraid. The place had been abandoned for as long as I could remember, standing tall and dark at the edge of town, like a decaying giant. People said it was haunted, but I didn't believe in ghosts, at least. Not then. It was a cloudy night when I decided to go. The moon was hidden behind thick layers of clouds, casting a dim, eerie light on everything. I could hear the wind whistling through the trees as I walked down the dirt path that led to the building. The closer I got, the more my heart pounded, but I told myself it was just nerves. I wasn't scared. I couldn't be. The entrance was a gaping hole where the front door used to be. The wood had rotted away, leaving splinters and jagged edges. I took a deep breath, stepped inside, and immediately felt the temperature drop. The air inside was heavy, almost suffocating, as if the building itself was holding its breath. My footsteps echoed as I moved through the first room. Dust covered everything, a thick, choking layer that made it hard to see what was beneath. Old furniture, broken and forgotten, was scattered around like the remains of a once lively place. The walls were peeling, revealing the bones of the building beneath. A faint smell of mildew and rot hung in the air. I moved slowly, trying to take in every detail. Something was unsettling about the silences, if the building was waiting for something. Every creak of the floorboards under my weight made me flinch. I kept telling myself it was just an old building, nothing more. But deep down, something didn't feel right. I walked through a narrow hallway, the walls closing in on me. My flashlight flickered, and I cursed under my breath. I tapped it a few times, and the light steadied. I could see the end of the hallway. Now a door slightly ajar. I don't know what made me push it open, but I did. The room beyond was larger, emptier. The windows were broken, and the wind howled through them, making the curtains dance like they were alive. I shined my light around the room, and that's when I saw it. In the far corner, a shadow moved slowly, deliberately. At first I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but then it moved again, and I realized it wasn't the wind. The shadow had a shape or form that was almost human, but not quite. It was darker than the night, like a piece of the building had broken off and come to life. A chill ran down my spine. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shadowy figure stood still, watching me. It had no eyes, but I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. Then, without warning, the figure moved. It slid across the floor without a sound, coming closer. And I finally found the strength to turn and run. I dashed down the hallway, my flashlight bouncing in my hand. The shadows seemed to stretch, reaching for me as I fled. I could hear something behind me, a soft rustling that grew louder and closer. With every step, I stumbled through the rooms, tripping over debris and broken furniture, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But I didn't dare stop. The building felt like a maze, twisting and turning, leading me in circles. I could feel the walls closing in, the darkness pressing down on me. Finally, I saw the exit, the hole where the front door used to be. I threw myself through it, falling onto the dirt outside. The cold night air hit me like a wave, and I scrambled to my feet. Looking back at the building, the shadowy figure was standing just inside, watching me. It didn't follow, but I could feel its presence like a weight on my chest. I didn't stop running until I was back on the main road, my legs burning and my lungs screaming for air. Only then did I slow down, looking back at the building one last time. It was just a dark shape against the night sky, silent and still. But I knew what I had seen. I never went back to that place, and I never told anyone what happened. But sometimes, when the night is quiet and the wind is still, I can feel that cold gaze on me again, as if the shadow never really let me go. It's a feeling that sends a chill down my spine, reminding me of that night and the darkness that lives just on the edge of the light.